Good evening, everyone. Was that trick or treat? No, I don't think so. No trick, no treat. The Buddha's description of the creation of the universe, or more accurately, multiverse, is that there is no beginning and no end. Now, while that, in the context of tonight, Science at Cal and the Bay Area Science Festival, might be difficult to wrap our minds around, so too is the notion of a beginning and an end. What could precede a beginning? Science and religion tackle the biggest questions of all, so fasten your seatbelt. I'm going to move quickly in my presentation of the Buddhist description of the beginning of the universe to a textual tradition as expressed in the Flower Garland Sutra, known as the Avatamsaka. To what the Buddha said about creation: continuous continuity, continuous creativity. 1 to a million Big Bangs happening concurrently with each new intentional thought. In other words, from this perspective, from this model, creation was not a historical event, not a noun, but a verb, creating. In fact, an ongoing process of codependent origination. Now, the Buddha proposed cycles rather than a linear beginning. This theoretical model, inasmuch as the Big Bang, solid state theory of Fred Hoyle, much discredited, and the quasi-solid state cosmology that evolved from that are all also theoretical models. Models in flux that evolve with each deeper probe into space with more and more sophisticated instruments. I remember in 2002 watching hearing the hair-raising cheers that came out of the laboratory after the first Hubble adjustment mission. Did anybody see that? It's on YouTube, by the way. That thrill when suddenly, after the corrections, it came into focus. And here were these very respectable, very dignified professors just shouting, "Yay!" as these images came into sharp focus. Since then, there have been several such missions and met with equal enthusiasm. So, worlds come into being, worlds dwell, worlds decay, and go void, all based on the principle of karma. The Buddha framed it in a way that is not static. These dynamic cycles of change move. They are infinitely responsive. Karma and the conscious multiverse need some definition. This word has already made it into the lexicon because it's shared alike with the Hindu classical texts. Karma is behavior and its results, habitual behavior, bodily actions, spoken words, intentional thoughts. These create seeds that later bear fruit. That's probably the simplest, broad brush definition of karma. Karma is activity based on desire, governed by the Buddhist law of causality. The analogy of gardening comes to mind right away. Plant beans, get beans. Plant apples, get apples. It's not the case that you can plant beans and get apples. Seeds planted in the past bring present harvest. Seeds planted in the present will bring a future harvest. Neither good nor bad, simply responsive to the seed. And according to this model, karma is the primary force that keeps us in the cycle of rebirth. True for individuals, true for worlds. A quote from this Avatamsaka Sutra says, "According with the karma that is done, thus the retribution comes about. The doer does not exist." All Buddhas explain karma in this way. So, worlds and sentient beings come into being by a force, not a bang, more like a whimper, in fact. but by the karma of living beings. Okay, let's check in here. No beginning, no end, dynamic, not static, constantly in change, change governed by laws of causality, codependent origination. Now, from the Buddha's perspective, it is entirely possible that there could be a Big Bang. In no sense is this canceled or denied, but to have it be a single originating event with a linear trajectory that would be happening in one corner, much as Professor Stoller told us, how insignificant would we be? So, centuries ago, it was not intuitive from our frame of reference to say that the world rotated on its axis, nor that it orbited around the sun. This was considered absurd and counterintuitive. But our frame of reference has shifted. Physics has undergone two major revolutions, the Galilean, the Einsteinian, after which nothing was the same. Old points of view were no longer valid from that time on. So, hearing this model proposed, I'm sure that some of you, as I am, are asking the question, how could what we observe at this macro level, through our instruments that can measure redshift and the cooling of electromagnetic fields into galaxies, how could we see something as tiny as consciousness and human intentionality? So the Buddha did not, in fact, ask us to take it on his authority. There's a famous text called the Kalama Sutra where he gives us the opportunity to test for ourselves. He said, do not believe these claims simply because it is a tradition maintained by oral repetition. Do not believe these claims just because there is an unbroken succession of practice. Do not believe these claims merely because it is hearsay. Do not believe these claims because they're in the scriptures, and so forth. We have a total of 9 reasons why not to believe anything he has said. Concluding with, do not believe just because, quote, our teacher says thus and thus. Whenever you realize by yourself that these are unwholesome, harmful, or condemned by wise people, and whoever fully or undertake or observe these claims lead to uselessness and suffering, you should abandon these claims. However, whenever we realize by ourselves that these are wholesome, unharmful, and are admired by wise people, whoever fully undertake or observe them, that they lead to usefulness and happiness, you should undertake them. So the Buddha is pulling the rug on his own theoretical model, asking us to verify it in ourselves. Now that moves me to the second point that I would like to make, that the Buddha's model at all times stresses the primacy of perception. That's echoed in a quote from a classical Chinese text called the Guanzi that says, what all people seek to know is that, but our means of knowing that is this. How can we know that? Only by mastering and perfecting this. Now, in the science that I was trained in, wanted to have me believe in what we might call scientific materialism. The idea that the real world exists consisting of mind-independent objects. We might also say that there's a law of scientific materialism that says there's actually one true and complete description of how the real world is. 3, we might say, truth involves some sort of correspondence between an existing world and our description of it. And 4, that it is not only possible but desirable for scientists and scholars to describe the world from the God's eye viewpoint of a completely detached and objective and value-neutral observer. So, can I give you those as the laws of scientific materialism. The Buddha said, indeed, that without a telescope, math, or science of astronomy, but with some very sophisticated methods for exploring the space of the mind and its relationship to the surrounding environment, we can indeed make perception primary. Here is the model. He says the physical world as we experience it, called the kama dhatu, the desire realm, the material realm, the realm of the senses, is an emerging realm, not fundamental, not baseline, out of which everything else emerges. So in other words, perception, the world reported to us by the senses is an emergent property. It comes forth from an underlying realm that is prior to and more fundamental than our human construct of mind and matter. That would be the rupa data, known as the form realm. Now, we hear that and we think Platonic, we think even Pythagorean, some pure form that is mathematically derivatable. It is something prior to, however, that rupa dhatu arises from something prior to and more fundamental than the form realm. That is the arupa dhatu, which we might correlate to pure mathematics, no forms whatsoever. So this is the Buddha's model. He says, perfect this if we would like to know that. The Buddha himself came up with this notion, and hundreds of generations of yogis have corroborated it exactly as described. It arises not from mathematical formula, but from experience. Deep meditation states where consciousness shuts down and the psyche implodes into a substrate consciousness known as the alaya, the storehouse consciousness, that is the repository for what are known as bijas, or seeds, impressions. The substrate consciousness is the portal to the form realm. Deeper states open a portal to the formless realm, and all these have been extensively mapped. Now, I'm presenting this model for your contemplation. Notice that at no time have I mentioned anything supernatural, anything mystical. Indeed, this is based entirely on empirical observation and experience. And the Buddha would say, come and taste. Come and experience yourself. Which leads me to the third point, that I think without apology we can present this 2,500-year-old model as an ancient technology. A technology used in the common laboratory of human consciousness. So, if this is the case, then we can ask ourselves, indeed, what does it matter? The last part of our topic tonight was, what does it matter? The model I want to present here is that this description of the universe's arising, dwelling, decaying, and going void is a profoundly sentient and kind construction, if I can say so. Dependent origination begins, and I'm really compelled by Professor Stahler's talk, to equate, although this is very suggestive, and I think I need to be careful, but this might come up in our conversation later. The notion that dark matter might be what the Buddha called avidya, ignorance. It's a very suggestive notion. Ignorance arises from desire. Now, the laboratory that the Buddha proposed, the laboratory of common consciousness, where the investigation and observance of the arising of experience from karma is based upon ancient technologies that begin with moral precepts. Now, we didn't hear from Professor Matt, perhaps later we can, about the Kabbalah students of Isaac Luria, the 16th century mystic from Saft, who demanded, before his students practiced their investigations in Kabbalah, that they adhere to a strict ethical discipline, that there were rules of behavior that calmed the mind, that allowed the insights to rise. This indeed is the ancient mind science technology that is profoundly moral in nature. The Buddha described it in three ways: character, concentration, and insight. Shila, samadhi, and prajna. So in fact, samadhi stillness is the source of the transformation of consciousness into wisdom, but samadhi has its source in the purity of disciplined sense observation. So if we can borrow this method, borrow this notion that Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna, character, stillness, and insight, is the source of the wisdom that creates wholesome human beings, then consciousness transforms into wisdom for generations. Now, I wanted to tell a story. I did, in my formation as a monk 35 years ago, I did a pilgrimage at one point where my practice entailed silence for 6 years. And the silence allowed me to observe the rising of thoughts in the mind and reactions to the senses. And at one point in Big Sur, a man rode by on a bicycle. I was there bowing with my monk colleague. And he said, been watching you fellas bow along Highway 1 here. And he said, I want you to know that I'm also a meditator, he said. I'm actually a scientist with NASA, but I'm very interested in what you all might be discovering here as you bow. And of course, I couldn't speak, but my colleague could. And so he said, oh, you're a scientist with NASA. Well, tell me, what do you do all day? He said, well, we're here on the peak. The weather's really good for astronomical observation here. He said, we can see to the edge of the universe now. And my colleague, who had a background in science, said, oh, actually, he said, I didn't realize the universe had an edge, he said. And the astronomer said, well, actually, he said, in all honesty, that is the case. Every time we invent a bigger telescope, we discover that the universe had a bigger edge than we thought, farther away. And so my companion, Heng Chao, said, well, he said, actually, I'll tell you the truth. What I understand is that we're doing the same job. And the astronomer said, how do you mean? He said, we're both looking into space. The only difference is the Buddhists turn the telescope around, he said. And the astronomer said, yes, he said, that's why I'm meditating.